The chandelier over the downtown hotel ballroom cast tiny constellations across the marble, and one of them landed squarely on the ring I wasn't wearing anymore, catching my eye just as Evan turned and saw me. His smile misfired in the space of a heartbeat, the way a light flickers before going out. And I felt the room lean toward the moment, like it wanted to hear what I'd say. Sloane's perfume reached me before she did white gardenia, the scent she used to spritz on my wrist before big nights when we were 20. I didn't move right away. I let the quartet's music carry that thin, electric hush between us, the kind that tells you a storm has arrived even if the windows are still. Evan's gaze dropped to the bracelet on my wrist, the one he once called too much sparkle for a Tuesday, and then lifted to the man at my side. You could watch the color drain from his face as if someone had opened a hidden valve. I didn't raise my voice or my chin. I just met his eyes and let him understand that the past he chose had finally circled back to collect. Call to action, CTA. Before I tell you how we reached that standoff, tell me where you're listening from tonight and if you've ever learned the hard way who your real friends are. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps me keep sharing these true family stories of betrayal and quiet justice. Main narrative backstory. My name is Marina Holt, and I was raised to believe that keeping your word is wealth you can spend anywhere. My dad taught high school history in Fort Worth, and my mom directed our church choir. We measured success by the kindness you left behind, not the car parked in your driveway. I carried that into adulthood, building an event planning business from a second-hand laptop and a shoebox of business cards. By 32, I could walk into an empty hotel ballroom with a clipboard and leave it humming like a living thing, every chair straight, and every candle timed to the hour it would matter most. That's how I met Evan. He arrived in a pressed suit, shook my hand like a man already late to tomorrow, and told me he admired people who made beauty look easy. Evan's world ran on league tables and renderings measured in square footage, and the kind of dinners where waiters know which glass to refill before you touch it. Mine was more ordinary, the right linen deliveries, a florist who saved me on holidays, a cousin's baby shower that made 3 generations cry happy tears. He liked to say we were a perfect match, his reach my finesse. When we married, we bought a narrow brick townhouse in Dallas with magnolias out front, and a kitchen I painted 3 times because it mattered to me that the light hit the walls the way morning deserved. If I noticed that Evan arranged his cufflinks with the same care I reserved for seating charts, I decided it was compatibility, not vanity. We were busy. We were building. And from the sidewalk, my life looked like a clean straight line. Sloane Whitaker has been my friend since freshman year at SMU. The girl who could turn a thrifted skirt into a runway moment and make a room exhale just by laughing. Her family's money was old and quiet, the kind you don't talk about at the table, and she never made me feel small for growing up on casseroles and coupon nights. She stood beside me at my wedding, steadied my hands when my veil snagged, and spent Sunday afternoons on my couch, swapping stories about work and men and the stubbornness of hope. Evan loved that she loved me. He said our friendship made me glow, and I believed him. The 3 of us formed an easy triangle of brunches and birthdays, and shared jokes, the kind you finish for each other without thinking. Here is the thing about harmony. No one tells you it's light enough to float but fragile enough to bruise. Evan's promotions came with late nights and conference weekends, and I learned the schedule of his ambition by the sound of suit bags zipping in the hallway. My business grew too slower and steadier with the kind of clients who came back because I remembered their mothers' names. When I signed my first 6-figure wedding, I poured sparkling water into flutes and toasted myself at the kitchen island, laughing at the mess of ribbon on the floor. Evan kissed my forehead, told me I was brilliant, and then asked lightly, almost playfully, if I planned to keep the house running, since his season had officially begun. I laughed with him because it felt safer than asking why my win sounded like permission to do more laundry. I know the very moment the air changed in our house, though nothing dramatic happened at all. It was an early summer evening, the lights still honey at 7, and Sloane swung by with a bottle of something crisp and French to celebrate the city contract my company had just landed. She leaned against the counter in a silk blouse the color of pale apricots and teased me about my habit of alphabetizing spice jars. Evan joked he was going to hire me to alphabetize his office too. Their laughter braided together as easily as fingers, and I remember thinking how lucky I was to be loved by people who understood each other. Later, after the dishes were drying in neat rows and the house had gone quiet, I caught a faint ribbon of Sloane's perfume on one of Evan's jackets and told myself it had brushed him when she hugged us both goodbye. The brain is a gifted editor when your heart demands a certain kind of story. I held the folded spa receipt between my fingers, smoothing the paper until it almost lost its creases. 2 treatments, listed one after the other at a hotel in Houston, where Evan had sworn his days were too full for anything but meetings. The numbers on the page blurred, but the implication didn't. I slipped it into the trash before he came downstairs, telling myself not to make a scene over what could be nothing. Still, something in me shifted that night, as though a floorboard under my feet had cracked, even if the house still looked the same. After that discovery, I started noticing things I once brushed aside. Evan had always been meticulous, but his new suits looked like they belonged to a man auditioning for a part he already thought he deserved. He bought a watch that cost more than my car and joked it was an investment in image. His laughter was too sharp, too rehearsed, and when Sloane teased him at dinners, he leaned into her words as though her approval carried more weight than mine. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that stress from his promotions explained the restlessness in his eyes, but deep down, I knew better. The rooftop cocktail party should have been a triumph. I had coordinated every detail candles timed to glow, just as the sun dropped a quartet tuned for background elegance and trays of hors d'oeuvres passing in perfect rhythm. Guests admired the skyline, and I should have been proud. Yet across the terrace, I caught sight of Evan and Sloane standing too close, her golden dress reflecting the last of the light. She laughed at something he whispered, her hand resting lightly on his sleeve. It was brief, no more than a second, but when she noticed me watching, her smile faltered before snapping back into place. That pause told me more than her words ever could. Later that summer, my company landed the biggest wedding contract I had ever secured. The deposit alone was enough to pay off months of bills and still leave breathing room for reinvestment. I prepared dinner, practically glowing, eager to share the news. Evan sat across from me with his glass of wine, nodded, and told me he was proud. But then he added almost casually, "It's wonderful, Marina, but this is just a little side income, right? You'll still keep the house as your main focus." His tone wasn't cruel, but the words hollowed something out of me. My success, the hours I poured into building credibility, were still just a hobby to him. I forced a smile, but the meal tasted like ash. The unease followed me into our holiday at a friend's lake house over the 4th of July. The afternoon passed easily, sun on the water, laughter rising from boats and glasses clinking against each other. When fireworks began that night, I went inside to fetch more drinks. From the doorway, I saw them again, Evan and Sloane, their heads bent close together on the dock, voices low against the bursts of light above them. They separated when I stepped out, but the air between them lingered heavy with whatever I had interrupted. I carried the bottles back, forcing my smile until my cheeks hurt. By September, the unease grew into something I couldn't excuse away. Evan returned from another conference with polished stories about long days of networking, but when I unpacked his luggage, a folded receipt slid into my hand. This time, it wasn't a spa. It was a dinner for 2 at a restaurant known for dim lighting and whispered deals charged to the firm's expense account. He said it was a client, of course, and his voice was smooth, practiced. I wanted to believe him, but the explanation felt worn like a script rehearsed too many times. I told myself I was protecting our marriage by not pressing harder, that asking too many questions might create cracks that weren't really there. But my body knew otherwise. My chest tightened when his phone buzzed at night, and I found myself studying his expressions when he spoke to Sloane, memorizing glances that lasted one beat too long. He kissed me goodbye each morning, and I wondered if his lips had carried someone else's perfume. It was a strange way to live, half in love, half in doubt, but still unwilling to pull the thread that might unravel everything. The unraveling came anyway. It was a Friday in late winter rain, pounding the streets in long, steady sheets. I came home, expecting quiet comfort, a glass of wine, and a blanket against the storm. Instead, the house was dark, too still, as though it were holding secrets in the corners. I changed out of my heels and tossed my phone on the dresser, only for the screen to light with a message I wasn't meant to see. Sloane's name glowed at the top. Below it, a photograph her on a beach, with Evan's arms snug around her waist, her lips pressed to his cheek. The caption read, "Couldn't be happier." My breath caught. My body wanted to believe it was old, some memento from years past, but the phone said otherwise, time-stamped, fresh, undeniable. My hands shook so hard, I almost dropped it. And then I heard the front door open. Evan came in, shaking rain from his coat, his eyes meeting mine, just as I held up the screen. "What is this?" I asked, my voice far calmer than my heart. He didn't fumble, didn't stammer, didn't even look surprised. He only sighed, irritation flashing across his face. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said, like I had peeked into a drawer marked private. I asked if it was true if he was with her. He shrugged, unapologetic. "I have been for a while," he said, as though it were nothing more than a change in routine. My world tilted with his words. He told me I had grown predictable, stale, and that Sloane matched where he was headed. I stood there stunned as he packed an overnight bag with no hesitation, no regret, not even a backward glance. When the door closed behind him, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the rain streaking down the glass, wondering how my life had hollowed out so quickly. 2 days later, they appeared publicly at a gala, smiling for cameras as if they had earned the right to flaunt their happiness. Sloane wore a red gown that caught every flashbulb, Evan's hand low on her back. I scrolled through the photos online, feeling the cuts reopen with each angle. Mutual friends called their voices tight with discomfort, unwilling to choose sides, but clearly dazzled by the new couple's shine. The betrayal wasn't just in the affair, it was in the way they flaunted it. Like my pain was collateral, they could spend freely. The final confirmation came when I learned the Cabo photograph had not been an accident. Sloane had been telling her circle about the relationship for months, eager to make it public. But Evan had urged patience. The text had been meant for someone else, not me, but her mistake had exposed what they could no longer contain. I realized betrayal wasn't a single moment of truth, but a slow bleeding, each cut sharper than the last, until there was nothing left to patch. I tried to go through the motions, moving into a smaller apartment, boxing up the wedding china, and scrolling past their endless images online. But each time I saw Sloane in one of my favorite dresses, or quoting words I had once said, I understood she hadn't just stolen my husband. She had been collecting pieces of my life for years, piecing together a version of me she thought was worth more when draped on her arm beside Evan. I told myself the storm would pass, that the ache would soften. But one night, staring at the glow of their faces on the television, as the anchor praised their philanthropy, I felt something colder than grief settle into my bones. Watching them shine on what used to be my stage, I knew my silence was the very foundation of their triumph. And I also knew silence would not last forever. The weeks after Evan's confession blurred into one another. I moved through them in a haze, packing boxes with hands that didn't feel like my own, sealing away pieces of a life I hadn't realized was already gone. Our townhouse, with its magnolia trees and sunlit kitchen, had been my anchor, but it quickly turned into a museum of echoes. I couldn't look at the marble counters without remembering how I'd polished them before his clients arrived, or at the balcony without seeing the ghost of us laughing together on summer nights. I signed a lease for a modest apartment on the edge of the city, small enough that silence pressed against the walls. The first evening there, I ate takeout noodles from a carton on the floor because my furniture hadn't arrived. I told myself it was temporary, that I would rebuild, but the truth was, I felt stripped down to the bone. I had been abandoned not just by a husband, but by the woman I trusted more than anyone else. Each night, I scrolled past photographs of them dressed in finery, their arms entwined faces glowing beneath chandeliers. I once dreamed of walking under myself. Friends reached out hesitant and awkward. Their voices carried that delicate strain of people trying to comfort without stepping into the crossfire. Some insisted they didn't know others offered to take me out for drinks, but I declined most invitations. I couldn't bear the thought of walking into a restaurant and catching my reflection against theirs on a screen above the bar. The humiliation felt inescapable, as if my private grief had been pinned up for the entire city to study. The sharpest wounds were not just from Evan, but from Sloane. I remembered the afternoons we spent sprawled across my sofa, her head tilted back in laughter while I poured us wine. She had listened to me confess my fears about Evan's long hours, nodding with sympathy, all the while knowing she was the reason for my unease. That knowledge cut deeper than anything Evan could have said. Betrayal from a spouse was devastating, but betrayal from a friend who knew every corner of my heart left me hollow. One evening, I pulled an old box from the closet filled with photographs of our college years. There we were, Sloane and I draped across dorm beds, our smiles wide and carefree, holding each other up through the awkwardness of becoming adults. I set the pictures out on the floor and stared at them until my vision blurred. The young women in those snapshots didn't know the future would twist like this. I gathered the photos back into the box, pressing the lid shut with shaking hands, and slid it under my bed. I wasn't ready to throw them away, but I couldn't leave them in plain sight either. My work faltered during those months. I canceled one event and stumbled through others, distracted by the constant stream of reminders. Clients noticed, and so did colleagues. Emily Grant, a planner I had known casually for years, took me aside after a luncheon. Her voice was soft, careful. "You don't have to carry it all at once, Marina," she said. "No one expects you to pretend this didn't happen." Her kindness cracked the dam I'd been trying to hold. That night, I wept until my chest ached, grateful for her compassion, yet ashamed that I had lost control in front of her. Bills piled up on my counter. Without Evan's connections, contracts that once came easily slipped through my fingers. The clients I had helped introduce to his firm now saw me as irrelevant, a reminder of something they preferred to forget. When I turned on the evening news for background noise, I saw him instead, Evan, standing beside Sloane at a fundraiser, cameras catching her red gown as though she were royalty. On her wrist was a bracelet I recognized immediately, one I had left in the drawer of our bedroom dresser when I moved out. The anchor praised their generosity, their commitment to the city. I muted the television and sat very still, the rage rising in me so sharply it tasted like metal. In those quiet hours, I realized grief had changed shape. It no longer looked like sobbing into pillows or avoiding mirrors. It had hardened into something colder, something sharper. I didn't want them back. I didn't want apologies or explanations. What I wanted was for them to feel the floor collapse beneath them the way it had under me. But I wasn't ready yet. For the time being, I remained silent, gathering strength like coals warming under ash. Nights stretched long in that apartment. Sometimes I lay awake listening to the hum of traffic outside, imagining their laughter echoing from some rooftop terrace. Other nights, I dreamed of confronting them in public, stripping away their polished smiles with the truth. But dreams dissolved with daylight, leaving me with the ache of reality. My heart was still too raw to move, but my mind had begun to stir in ways I didn't yet understand. Even in silence, the betrayal followed me into small corners of life. At the grocery store, I avoided aisles where couples compared dinner plans. At church, I watched my mother's worried eyes follow me as she sang her voice steady, even when mine cracked. My father offered practical advice about contracts and finances, but his hands lingered on my shoulder longer than usual, the way a parent touches an adult child when they wish they could still shield them. Their quiet support steadied me, but it couldn't erase the emptiness. One Sunday afternoon, I walked the park trails alone, the air damp with spring rain. Families passed me with strollers and laughter, but I moved slowly, listening to the rhythm of my own breath. By the time I reached the edge of the pond, I realized I had stopped crying altogether. The grief was still there, but the tears had dried up. What replaced them was heavier, anchored in my chest, like stone. That was the first time I understood that silence wasn't weakness. It was waiting. When I returned home, I found another photo of them online, Evan and Sloane smiling at an art auction. She wore a gown that looked eerily similar to one I had once hung in my closet, and his hand rested on her back in the exact spot it used to rest on me. I stared at the screen until the edges of the image sharpened into clarity. It wasn't that they had fallen in love. It wasn't some tragic accident or sudden shift of the heart. It had been deliberate, a theft carried out in plain sight, piece by piece, until I had nothing left. The realization didn't bring relief. It didn't even bring fresh anger. It brought something quieter, heavier, but steadier too. They hadn't just taken what was mine. They had assumed I would disappear, quietly forgotten, as they built their empire. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I poured myself a glass of wine, sat at the kitchen counter, surrounded by unpaid bills, and stared at their photo on the television screen. For the first time since it began, I no longer felt broken. I felt sharpened. The turning point came on a sharp winter afternoon when I finished setting up a luncheon for a corporate client. The ballroom gleamed, centerpieces perfect and guests smiling. It should have been a moment of quiet pride, but when I collected my check at the reception desk, the woman slid the envelope across with a hesitant look. "Your ex-husband and his wife were here last week," Janet said, her tone careful, as if she were betraying a confidence. My stomach went tight. "Asking what?" She glanced down, clearly uncomfortable. "Just wondering if your business was still going. They said they hoped you were doing well, but—" Her words trailed off, but the shift in her eyes told me the rest. It wasn't concern. It was measurement. The word relevant echoed in my mind the whole walk to the parking garage. To them, my worth was reduced to whether my name still meant anything in the rooms they wanted to control. Outside, the air cut cold against my face, but it wasn't the weather that froze me. Across the street, a black town car pulled up, and there they were. Evan in his tailored suit, Sloane draped in cashmere. He held her hand, his laugh ringing out before he even noticed me. For a brief second, I just stood there, watching them like strangers. Evan's grin widened when his eyes finally met mine. He lifted his hand in a small, mocking wave. "Marina, you look good," he called across the traffic. His voice carried easily casual and self-satisfied, as if I were some distant acquaintance, no longer part of his real life. Sloane's smile faltered for the briefest moment, but Evan's only grew brighter, as though my diminished place was proof of his own ascent. Every instinct told me to shout to demand recognition for everything I had given him, for every door I had opened that allowed him to stand so comfortably on that curb. Instead, I smiled back, small and polite, the kind of expression you give to someone you'll never see again. I walked on without another word, though my heart pounded so hard I could hear it. When I reached my car, my hands shook so violently I had to grip the steering wheel before I could drive away. That was the moment clarity settled in. They weren't afraid of me, not in the slightest. In their eyes, I was finished, neutralized, a chapter closed. To Evan, I was nothing more than a ghost of a past he had already rewritten. To Sloane, I was the friend she had successfully replaced my role, erased from her story without consequence. They believed they had won, and in that belief, they had left themselves unguarded. Back at my apartment that evening, I poured a glass of wine and pulled an old leather-bound notebook from the drawer. Its pages had once been filled with plans for my business venues I dreamed of, booking clients I hoped to court, budgets scribbled late into the night. Now I turned to a clean page and wrote a single word at the top: reckoning. Beneath it, I began listing everything they had built that could be taken apart. Money, reputation, influence, relationships. I thought about the events that kept them visible in Dallas society, the investors who kept Evan's firm afloat, the committees that gave Sloane her polished image. Each of those things looked strong on the surface, but I knew the truth. They were delicate, fragile as glass, and all it would take was one well-placed crack to make the whole structure shatter. Over the next weeks, I began paying closer attention. At galas, I lingered at the edges of their conversations, watching which people Evan rushed to greet and which ones he ignored. I noticed Sloane's tendency to arrive fashionably late, to slip away early when she grew bored, leaving behind hosts who covered their irritation with brittle smiles. I took mental notes and later filled pages with details, names, patterns, opportunities. I didn't confront them, not yet. Silence had become my armor. If they thought I was harmless, they would never see the knife until it was too late. I reached out quietly to old contacts. Coffee dates, industry mixers, chance encounters that didn't look like strategy but were. I asked questions without asking questions, and people were more willing to talk than I expected. They spoke of Evan's firm stretching itself thin, of risky developments that looked good on paper but bled cash in reality. They spoke of Sloane's charm wearing thin in certain circles, of her habit of forgetting small courtesies that people in her world never forgot. One evening, standing in front of my bathroom mirror, I fastened a pair of earrings I hadn't worn in years. I studied the woman staring back at me. She no longer looked broken, no longer looked like someone waiting to heal. What I saw instead was focus, clear and unshakable. The grief that once hollowed me had transformed into purpose. I understood something vital that night. They had built their life on my silence. Every smug smile, every red carpet photo, every whispered word about whether I was still relevant, each of those moments depended on me staying small. But I was no longer small. I was no longer silent. I didn't need to scream or beg or expose myself to ridicule. All I needed was patience, precision, and time. That was the night I truly awoke. The rain had stopped outside, and the city lights shimmered against wet pavement. For the first time in nearly a year, I opened my balcony door and let the cool air fill the apartment. It didn't feel suffocating anymore. It felt like possibility. The first move came quietly, almost invisible, like a single card slid into place at the start of a long game. I didn't storm into their world or announce myself. Instead, I stepped into the background of the rooms they thought they owned and began taking notes. At an art auction one spring evening, I arrived just late enough to be noticed, dressed in sapphire silk that caught the light with each step. The moment I crossed the floor, I saw their eyes land on me. Evan's flickering only briefly, Sloane's holding a touch longer, the faintest crease forming at the edge of her smile before she smoothed it away. I didn't confront them, not that night. I spoke warmly, even graciously, and allowed Sloane to lean in for a perfumed hug. "It's been forever," she said, with the tone of someone performing kindness for an audience. "It has," I answered, steady, no tremor in my voice. My words were simple, harmless on the surface. But just over her shoulder, I caught the gaze of a man I recognized, an investor Evan had been courting for months. I offered him a small, measured smile, one that said we should speak another time. He nodded almost imperceptibly, and that was all I needed. By the end of the night, I had 3 new numbers in my phone and 2 dinner invitations, none of which came from Evan or Sloane. I left without looking back at them, driving home through the city lights, with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't triumph. It was precision. My presence was no longer an afterthought in their orbit. It was a reminder that I still carried weight, and they had been foolish to forget it. The months that followed were filled with quiet, deliberate steps. I learned patience was the foundation of revenge, that waiting was more powerful than striking too soon. My notebook filled with pages of connections, deals, whispers gathered over coffee and lunches. With Evan, the cracks appeared in numbers. His firm had grown too fast, chasing high-profile developments with borrowed money and borrowed confidence. The luxury condo tower he boasted about in glossy press releases was already months behind schedule, its costs spiraling. I didn't need to fabricate anything. I only needed to guide the right questions into the right ears. With Sloane, the weaknesses lay in her image. She had built herself into a darling of Dallas's philanthropic scene, but her influence rested on fragile ground. I watched her arrive late to luncheons, glide out early from fundraisers, brush past women whose names carried more weight than hers. Those slights accumulated like stones, and I made sure to stand near enough when conversation shifted, planting nothing more than a faint note of concern. How busy she seemed, how much she had taken on. People filled the silence themselves, and by the time the thought took root, it was theirs, not mine. One relationship in particular opened doors I hadn't expected. Mark Adler, one of Evan's junior partners, was ambitious, but perpetually overlooked. Over lunch, he spoke too freely about the firm's struggles, his frustration spilling out in details that should never have reached my ears. He mentioned an upcoming client whose investment could double Westbrook's valuation, a prize Evan was desperate to secure. I wrote the name carefully into my notebook, not to attack directly, but to prepare. If there was hesitation in that client's mind, I intended to be the one to shape it. The opportunity came faster than I anticipated. The client's wife reached out to me for help with a charity gala she was chairing. I delivered flawlessly down to the last folded napkin, and she began inviting me for coffee, asking for advice that drifted beyond flowers and lighting. "My husband likes Evan," she confided once, "but I'm not sure he's careful." I didn't agree or disagree. I simply said, "Sometimes the best deals are the ones you don't rush into." That was all it took to plant a seed of doubt. Meanwhile, I kept appearing in their spaces without drawing attention to myself. At fundraisers, I smiled politely across crowded rooms. At luncheons, I shook hands and excused myself before conversations overstayed their welcome. I knew Evan noticed me once at a museum, opening, his eyes fixed on me from across the gallery. I felt his stare unreadable, but he never approached. Perhaps he wasn't sure what to make of me. Perhaps he thought my presence was coincidence. Either way, his silence suited me. Sloane was less comfortable. At one benefit dinner, she leaned toward me with her trademark brittle smile and said, "It's good to see you out again, Marina. I was worried you'd gone quiet." I matched her tone with warmth, complimented her dress, and walked away before she could dig further. Her smile didn't reach her eyes as she watched me leave. That moment told me my presence was working small, subtle enough to shift the air around them. 6 months into my quiet campaign, the framework was in place. Phase 1: erode their standing by highlighting the cracks already visible. Phase 2: weaken Evan's business through hesitations planted in the minds of investors. Phase 3: allow their allies to become liabilities, shifting loyalties without them realizing. The final move I knew would have to be personal. Public humiliation wasn't enough. They needed to feel the same hollow in their bones that they had left in me. I tested my own resolve constantly. Late at night, I spread papers across my kitchen counter. Financial reports, articles, scribbled notes from conversations, and forced myself to study them like a puzzle. I practiced patience, resisting the temptation to move too soon. Each piece had to align before I acted. If Evan and Sloan ever suspected my hand, the game would be lost. But if they continued to underestimate me, their downfall would feel inevitable. By autumn, invitations to the city's biggest charity ball began to circulate. One of the hosts, a woman I had recently helped with her daughter's wedding, sent a thick envelope with a handwritten note, "Would love for you to attend as my guest." I knew instantly that Evan and Sloan would be there. The ball wasn't about money, it was about influence, and appearances mattered more there than anywhere else. I stood in front of my closet on the night of the event, running my hands over silk and sequins, choosing carefully. I settled on a gown of deep emerald, bold but elegant, a color that refused to be ignored. As I fastened the clasp at the back of my neck, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at me no longer looked fragile, no longer looked broken. She looked deliberate, composed, and steady. The city skyline glittered through the ballroom's glass walls when I arrived. Conversations hushed, then swelled again as I stepped inside. I felt eyes turn not just toward me, but toward the man at my side, someone familiar to every investor in the room, though no one yet connected the dots. I let them whisper, let them wonder. Evan and Sloan moved through the crowd at the far end of the room, still wearing the armor of their perfect smiles. They hadn't seen me yet. The charity ball shimmered with polished marble chandeliers glowing like constellations overhead, and glasses raised in practiced laughter. I walked in on Graham's arm, his steady presence grounding me as the crowd subtly shifted to make space. Dallas thrived on spectacle, and tonight was its stage. The hum of conversation faltered for a breath when my name was announced, followed by his. Ellington, a single word that needed no introduction in the city. I didn't look toward Evan immediately. I let the whispers ripple first, let the realization pass through the room in waves before his eyes found me. When they did, I felt it even before I turned. The air tightened across the ballroom as if pulled taut by invisible hands. His face drained of color, the champagne glass trembling in his grip. Sloane's smile faltered just slightly when she followed his gaze, her poise cracking for the briefest second before snapping back in place. I stood tall, emerald silk flowing against the polished floor, my husband's hand resting lightly at the small of my back. I didn't need to speak. The first blow had already landed with my presence. Evan's firm, Westbrook Partners, was heavily tied to Graham's capital group, though I doubted Evan had connected that truth until the moment he saw us together. His world tilted, and I watched him try to recover to plaster the charm back across his face. But his eyes betrayed him. They flicked between me, the diamond on my hand, and Graham's calm composure. He understood what it meant. He just didn't want to admit it yet. The evening unfolded with a rhythm I had carefully choreographed. Photographers swept the floor, and I knew which ones favored unguarded moments. Society columnists sat where whispers carried best. When the quartet shifted into a new piece, I felt the energy shift again, signaling the second move. Across the ballroom, 2 members of Westbrook's board approached Evan, their smiles polite but carved with steel. They drew him towards the terrace glass doors, closing behind them, the city skyline reflecting in the panes like a silent witness. I didn't need to hear the words to know what was said. Graham's firm had quietly provided the document's expense reports showing conference weekends charged to the company that conveniently overlapped with Cabo hotels and spa packages. Numbers didn't lie, even when Evan did. I watched his hands open in disbelief, saw his lips move quickly as though excuses could save him. But the board members' faces remained cold, professional. When he finally lowered his head, I knew the audit had been made official. His authority was suspended. Inside, the gala continued. Guests drifted toward the auction tables, their voices carrying across the marble with forced enthusiasm. One of the items under glass gleamed under the lights, a vintage diamond bracelet. My bracelet. The appraisal papers lay beside it, stamped in my name, accompanied by a photograph from years ago showing me wearing it on our anniversary. And next to that, a recent image Sloane smiling on local television, that same bracelet glittering on her wrist. The description was brief, almost delicate. This piece was previously mislaid and has now been recovered. I was across the room when she reached the display. Her steps slowed her laughter too loud. She tried to brush it off as coincidence, murmuring something to the woman beside her. But the curator approached with quiet insistence. "Ma'am, may I confirm provenance with you privately?" The word cut sharper than a blade. Provenance. Insurance. Evidence. Sloane's fingers faltered at the clasp before she forced another smile, the kind that strained at the edges. But the cameras had already caught the hesitation. Evan returned from the terrace as this unfolded, his face ashen, the confidence stripped clean. He intercepted her with a hand raised, but it was too late. Guests had already begun whispering. A photographer leaned closer. The bracelet was unclasped, surrendered into velvet, the sound of it closing in the curator's palm, softer than silk, but heavier than stone. That tiny sound echoed through the room in ways words never could. Then came the final cue. At exactly 8:42, phones buzzed in pockets and handbags. A public notice appeared online, stop work order, filed against Evan's prized condo project. The zoning violations were straightforward: expired permits, non-compliant barriers. Nothing dramatic, nothing invented, just the truth released at the perfect moment. Guests began murmuring aloud, their voices overlapping. "Isn't that Westbrook's tower? What happens now?" The questions spread faster than Evan could answer, because he couldn't. The company's counsel had already collected his phone, cutting off his connection to the world he once commanded. I remained seated at my table, calm hands folded in my lap. Graham leaned toward me, his tone even as he addressed the room. "Our firm believes sunlight is the best disinfectant. We've engaged an independent auditor and suspended 2 projects pending review." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of his words traveled on the silence that followed, pressing into every corner of the ballroom. Evan tried to protest, his voice too loud, too strained. He called it a setup, sour grapes, a hit job. But the board member nearest him countered with facts. The expense receipts, the duplicate spa charges, the flights with no meetings on record. Each fact landed like a stone, stripping away his bluster until nothing remained. Guests shifted away, their shoulders turning subtly, creating space, as if his disgrace might stain their gowns and suits. Sloane reached for him, but he brushed her hand aside, eyes burning with a mixture of anger and shame. Loyalty, I thought, was too expensive for someone who had only ever paid with borrowed credit. The crowd no longer saw them as golden. They saw them as fragile, breakable, exposed. The evening didn't end in a scene. It ended in absence. Evan escorted from the ballroom by security, his shoulders hunched as though the weight of the city had finally pressed down. Sloane trailed behind her earrings, slipping into a velvet tray at the curator's quiet request. No one raised their voices. No glass shattered. Only the steady, relentless clicking of cameras capturing the end of their reign. I remained seated, my bracelet glittering once more at my wrist, as I lifted a glass of water. I didn't toast. I didn't gloat. I simply let the silence stretch until the music returned soft and slow, as if the night itself had decided to move on. By the time I woke the next morning, the city was already humming with the story. The Dallas Business Ledger ran a photo across its front page, Evan being ushered toward an elevator, his expression hollow, while Sloane trailed a step behind him, eyes fixed on the floor. No words could have cut deeper than that image. The headline spelled out the rest: Westbrook VP suspended amid audit projects frozen. The golden couple that once seemed untouchable was suddenly the cautionary tale whispered over morning coffee and office cubicles. In less than 48 hours, lenders had pulled financing on Evan's prized condo tower. Contractors walked off the site, leaving steel beams exposed against the sky like broken bones. The city cemented the stop-work order, and investors smelling blood stripped him of voting rights before appointing interim management. His name vanished from future projects almost overnight. The empire he'd built on charm and stolen contacts collapsed with the speed of a building set for demolition. Sloane's unraveling came just as swiftly, though it wore a different face. The bracelet incident spread across social media in still frames and short clips, her forced smile freezing in humiliation as she unclasped jewelry that was never hers to claim. Committees she once chaired quietly removed her polite emails, citing new directions that everyone knew were just veiled dismissals. Invitations stopped arriving, the ones she lived for, and her calls began going unanswered. Where she had once glowed under chandeliers, she now stood on the outside, looking in, the glitter gone. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. My silence became its own weapon, stronger than any public statement. I went about my work as if nothing had happened, meeting with clients, planning events, shaking hands in rooms where their names were no longer spoken with admiration. If anything, their absence was louder than their presence had ever been. People noticed the space they left behind, and they noticed who had quietly stepped into it. 2 weeks later, I heard they'd sold their uptown house. The marble foyer and rooftop terrace that once hosted their soirees were reduced to a line in a real estate listing priced to sell. The proceeds barely covered their debts, and by the end of the month, they were in a plain condo outside the city, the kind of building with no valet, no doorman, no neighbors worth knowing. It was a life they had never imagined for themselves, stripped of the glitter and polish they once weaponized against me. For me, the months that followed were clean. My business expanded steadily, boosted by returning clients and new ones who came through Graham's network. City permits, once dragged out by red tape, now moved swiftly, almost as if the zoning board itself had decided to reward diligence. I wore the bracelet again at my first gala after the ball, and every camera seemed to find it each time I raised my glass. The photograph landed in a lifestyle spread, the caption, simple, Mrs. Ellington radiant in vintage diamonds. The piece belonged to me again in every sense. Then late in the spring, an envelope arrived without a return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded neatly. The handwriting was Sloane's elegant loops I knew as well as my own. Marina, you got what you wanted. He's ruined. I'm ruined. Are you happy now? At first glance, it seemed like a plea for closure. But as I turned it in my hands, I noticed a faint smudge of blue ink in the corner, the kind left by a bank stamp. Texas State Bank. It hadn't been written from her home. It had been written in the lobby of a branch, likely while she waited for a loan officer. That realization tightened something inside me. They hadn't just lost their place in society. They'd burned through their savings too. The letter wasn't an apology. Not really. It was a test balloon, an attempt to tug at old bonds in hopes I might reach out, maybe even help. I folded it twice, slid it into the back of my notebook, and never answered. Silence was still the sharpest blade I had. Evan tried once too, I learned through Mark Adler, his junior partner, that he had asked after me. Not directly, never in words that could be traced, but with the strained tone of a man desperate for a foothold. Mark told me Evan had asked if I might take a meeting, said he just wanted to talk. I smiled at that the same way I had smiled across the street months earlier when he waved as though I were an acquaintance. I gave Mark no answer, only a gentle change of subject. Evan would hear my refusal not in words, but in the absence of them. And so they were left with what they had created, a smaller life, heavy with whispers and shadows. I pictured them sometimes moving through grocery aisles, where no one stopped to greet them, driving streets, where no valet opened the door, feeling the sting of being unremarkable. For two people who had built their world on being envied, there was no punishment more fitting. The letter from Sloane had been her last attempt to reach for the life she once flaunted, but it went unanswered. Evan, too, never found the courage to face me again. Their names slipped from invitations, their faces vanished from society pages, and soon enough, they became a cautionary tale that new couples whispered about when they thought no one was listening. In the end, silence carried them further into obscurity than any words I could have spoken. For me, life began to flow in a steadier rhythm. My business thrived not because I chased revenge, but because I poured my energy back into what I loved. Clients returned, new opportunities opened, and doors that had once been closed were now held wide. Graham stood at my side through it all, not as a rescuer, but as a partner who believed in me. With him, I learned what it felt like to be valued without conditions, cherished without competition. Looking back, I realized that Evan and Sloane's betrayal, as devastating as it was, gave me something I might never have found otherwise. It stripped me of illusions, but in doing so, it handed me clarity. I learned to stand without needing anyone's permission to measure my worth, not by who applauded beside me, but by how I carried myself when no one was watching. That strength became the foundation of everything that followed. My parents watched the transformation with quiet pride. My father would remind me over Sunday dinners that resilience runs deep in our family, while my mother often said grace with a new softness, as though she too understood that dignity was its own prayer. Even Emily, my loyal friend and colleague, admitted she had doubted whether I could rise from the ruins, but she smiled when she said I had proven her wrong in the best possible way. I wore the bracelet again at another gala months after the storm had passed. The diamonds caught the light as they always had, but this time they didn't feel like trophies of survival. They felt like a reminder that what is rightfully yours will find its way back to you, no matter who tries to claim it. That evening, people didn't whisper about scandal or betrayal. They spoke instead of the work I was building, the projects I was leading, and the quiet steadiness that comes from walking through fire without letting it consume you. Evan and Sloane faded into the background of Dallas life, living in a place where no one cared about their names or their past parties. They became ordinary, and perhaps that was the hardest punishment of all. For two people who once believed they were untouchable, ordinary must have felt like exile. I didn't hate them anymore. I didn't pity them either. I simply let them go, the way you release something that no longer has power over you. What I carried forward was not the bitterness of what they'd done, but the knowledge of what I had overcome. Betrayal had left its mark, yes, but it had also carved out space for a new kind of strength. I had rebuilt with my own hands, with honesty and patience, and the life I lived now was richer because of it. Justice had been served not through shouting, not through spectacle, but through steady, undeniable truth. If there's anything I've learned from this journey, it's that dignity is not something anyone else can give you, and it's not something they can take away. It lives in how you choose to respond when the world tries to break you. Sometimes revenge isn't about a final blow. It's about showing the people who underestimated you that your silence is stronger than their noise and your resilience is louder than their applause. Before we close, I'd love to know which part of this journey spoke most deeply to you. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if these stories of resilience and quiet justice bring comfort, stay connected here. After all, sometimes the best revenge is living a life you can be proud of.